Chapter 43. Mob Mentality. So what became of the advertised angry hordes with their hooks and diabolical plans to overrun the execution? It appears they were just another media fabrication. The Toronto Evening Star summed it up best when it reported, "The mobs failed to arrive before night and it is not likely they ever started." At the moment Wheeler rocketed skyward, the grounds surrounding the jail were barren. Van Blarcom's scheme had worked and, despite Radcliffe's predictions of failure and the nebulous threat of rioting, the execution had gone off without a hitch. Eventually the press realized they had been duped and the media spin machine cranked into full gear. Having once trumpeted the threat of the maddening crowds, the news agencies now scrambled to explain their absence. The Acadian Recorder blamed the dearth of crowds on Wheeler's inherent lack of sex appeal. The idea appears to impress itself on the popular mind everywhere that Peter Wheeler was a very low order of criminal indeed. There was nothing mysterious or romantic about him. Sheriff Van Blarcom took offense at the notion, arguing it was his quick-witted rescheduling of the hanging that averted certain disaster. A strange competition ensued over who or what deserved the credit for thwarting a non-existent threat, a pointless bout with no true victor. Although the crowds were thin on the ground at 2:21 a.m., even as Wheeler's feet dangled inches above it, the throng grew quickly just before daybreak. In the bluing dawn, thousands roused themselves from their drunken somnolence and began the slow march up the hill toward the jail. When met with the news that they had been robbed of the much-anticipated main attraction, all the crowd could do was wonder, horror-struck, at the sheer effrontery on offer. They had come to see a hanging and, suffice to say, they did not respond well. Word soon spread throughout town, Wheeler was dead. The execution was done. Digby's waterfront had its charms but none could compete with a man being put to death. The crowd, at first dumbfounded and visibly disappointed, quickly grew petulant and punishing. Flower beds were trampled, gates were pulled down, and a growing number of revelers took up residence in the church graveyard adjacent to the jail, hell-bent on retaliation. The more inebriated in attendance began hurling taunts and barbs aimed squarely at the sheriff's head. Although the drunken jeers of a mob rarely leave room for misinterpretation, one publication managed to find a silver lining in the thunderheads growing over the Van Blarcom residence. Nimbly sidestepping the pickled taunts and slurred threats, the Yarmouth Herald put its finger squarely on the pulse of the throng and declared, "The work of the sheriff was much admired by the multitude." The crowd's fictitious admiration aside, Benjamin Van Blarcom now found himself in a rather tight spot. In his efforts to circumvent civil unrest, Van Blarcom had inadvertently kicked a hornet's nest of pent-up anger and liquor-fueled rage. The disgruntled crowd were not wielding hooks or pitchforks but their propensity for violence was clear. As the teeming masses surrounded the jail, Van Blarcom became a prisoner in his own home and it would take nothing short of a miracle to placate the crowd at this late juncture. Van Blarcom prided himself on two things: being a man of action and thinking on his feet. As the abuse and hectoring echoed throughout his home, an idea began to hatch in the sheriff's quicksilver brain. It was unconventional and more than a little distasteful, to be sure, but it was the only notion he could summon on such short notice. To satisfy a mob cheated of a brutal death, Sheriff Van Blarcom would give them the next best thing, what remained of Wheeler himself. He ran to the basement and ordered his deputy son to put Peter's body on display for all to see. The lid was pried off of the cheap pine coffin and the box was mounted on a bier in front of the jailhouse. At the sight of the corpse, the legions went wild. Thunderous applause erupted in waves, peppered with cheers and hoots of joy as the herd surged forward en masse to catch a glimpse of the recently departed. The coffin proved the perfect focal point for their rage and a sort of ordered bedlam ensued. Staggered lines formed as the curious filed past the open box, poking and prodding at Wheeler, as if hoping he might sit up and take offense. In keeping with Victorian notions of modesty and decorum, the Daily Sun reported that women were conspicuous by their absence, although no other source noted any such segregation of the sexes. By all other accounts, both genders embarrassed themselves in equal measure. Peter Wheeler, now well past caring, endured the indignity with his usual stoic grace. According to the Morning Chronicle, Peter's face wore a peaceful, contented look with an entire absence of anything to indicate that any suffering had been felt at death. So placid a countenance no doubt disappointed the gawkers, who wanted the dead man's face to be locked in a mortal grimace befitting so terrible an end. Van Blarcom left Wheeler laying in state for more than 2 hours as the throng converged on the coffin. When all seemed satisfied with their glimpse of mortality, the sheriff ordered the coffin lid to be affixed and the remains were carried to the waiting grave in the jail's rear courtyard. Captains Bowles and Evans of that Army of Salvation attempted to hold a simple graveside service, but by this point, the angry mob numbered several thousand and many of them joined in raising a frightful howl. using all sorts of shouts, jeers and other noises to interrupt the eulogy. Having been denied a public execution, their ill feeling had to work off in some way. As Harris and Evans made ready to lower the coffin, the crowd erupted in a chorus of chants, "Throw him in, tear him open, and pitch the bastard in head first." The taunts served only to rile an already hostile and unruly crowd into full-blown mayhem. As the people relegated to the rear began to push forward, those lining the grave were thrust onto the coffin and a few were forced into the open grave itself. Hoping to avoid complete pandemonium, Harris ordered the coffin lowered and the grave swiftly sealed. The crowd, drunk and disorderly almost to a man, continued their jeering to the very last. As the final clump of dirt was tamped down, there was nothing left to shout about and the hordes decamped in search of livelier entertainment. Diversions were not hard to come by, as the day seemed to make even the sanest man run mad. In the hours before Wheeler was hanged, Walter W. Payson seemed as normal as any of his good Christian neighbors. He was 53 years of age, a relatively successful farmer and a resident and ratepayer of the town of Digby. He and his wife Ann were active members of the local Methodist church and together they had raised 9 fine children. It was said, on good authority, that Walter was as solid as they come. He was not given to wild flights of fancy or obvious spouts of paranoia, he never had any trouble with the law and never showed much interest in local politics. Those who knew him thought he was the salt of the earth. Like everyone else in the county, Walter had some loose association with the Wheeler-Kempton debacle. In early May, Payson was among the witnesses who provided affidavits to Judge Townsend in support of the motion for a change of venue. His testimony recalled numerous caustic comments about Wheeler that Payson had overheard in town. Aside from that, Payson had never met Wheeler prior to the unfortunate events of January 28, 1896, or had any direct dealings with him in the months since. But as Wheeler shuffled off his mortal coil, something in Walter W. Payson came unglued. Never one to espouse conspiracy theories, at least not in polite company, Walter became convinced there was something hinky about Wheeler's execution and he intended to do something about it. In the cold, clear light of dawn, as the crestfallen hordes formed outside the courthouse complex, Walter Payson muscled his way into the Digby jail. Tumbling down the stairs, Payson thrust a handwritten note into the hand of Sheriff Van Blarcom. The message was penned in a shaky cursive but contained surprisingly coherent text, demanding an immediate public autopsy of Wheeler on the grounds that when hanged, Wheeler was under the influence of an opiate. The note offered no explanation as to how its author reached this conclusion. Walter W. Payson, who held no public office or civic powers, ended with a final bold declaration. He forbade Sheriff Van Blarcom from burying Wheeler's body until the autopsy could be performed. The note left Van Blarcom scratching his head and mildly amused. The sheriff had conducted the execution and was with Wheeler in the hours before his death. The autopsy, cursory though it was, had been completed hours before and the coroner and his jury had already signed off on the report. Even if Payson was granted his request, comprehensive toxicology testing and drug screens, now a standard part of every medical legal death investigation, were still decades in the future. At that moment in history, there was no way of knowing if the allegations were true. What the sheriff knew for certain was that the farmer had no jurisdictional authority to stop the proceedings. Van Blarcom shook his head. He had predicted the execution would bring out the loonies, he just never thought Walter Payson would be among them. With as much patience as he could muster, the sheriff informed Payson that an autopsy had been conducted. Van Blarcom gave Payson his personal assurances that drugs were not involved in the death. Deeming the matter closed, Van Blarcom excused himself, having far more pressing issues to attend. The sheriff was satisfied but Payson clearly was not. Walter would not be denied and if the sheriff refused to listen to reason, Payson knew a far more powerful ally who would mark his words. He had read every inch of the media coverage for the past 8 months and Payson knew journalists were hungry for any fresh scandal on the case. Spying a huddled mass of newsmen, the gentleman farmer held an impromptu press conference on the steps of the Digby courthouse. He once again identified himself as a town resident and taxpayer, then Payson laid out his conspiracy theory for the assembled media throng. The response was not quite what Payson had hoped. As a unit, the press corps turned their backs in the middle of his tirade and moved on, looking for more palatable fare. Only 2 papers, the Morning Chronicle and the St. John Daily Telegraph, bothered to report on Payson's accusations. Both publications treated the story as just another footnote in their vast compendium of the day's tragic events. Undaunted, Payson fired off letters to the editors of the local papers but his conspiracy theory never found traction. Eager as they were for scuttlebutt, no editor wanted to dive into Payson's troubled waters. Weeks later, Rumors began to circulate that Payson had taken matters into his own hands. Local gossips whispered that the farmer was so convinced he had discovered a major governmental conspiracy, he went to the small graveyard behind the courthouse and dug up Wheeler's body. The strange rumor took hold because of an auspiciously timed coincidence. The insinuations began making the rounds right about the time Wheeler's remains were disinterred from the temporary gravesite and moved to his permanent burial plot. Nothing in the historical record suggests Payson actually exhumed Wheeler's coffin, but oddly enough, the suggestion that he did received far more attention than his initial cries of conspiracy.